Hello, Mars here. This video is going to be a little bit different. I'm changing up the format. For the next few videos, I'm going to just experiment with different video formats. For this video, I'm going to do a smaller, just response video, but with gameplay B-roll, well, gameplay as the B-roll, to hopefully allow me to make certain videos a lot faster. So while I make other bigger video projects in the background, I can still upload videos and not just have a bunch of dead air. So for this video, I'm going to be responding to PragerU. The next video, I might just do a lot of off-the-cuff stuff, so expect that for the next video. But this video, voice recordings and gameplay B-roll. The last video took a lot out of me, so the next big professional project won't be for quite a bit. But in the meantime, I will be uploading smaller videos like this one, probably either just ranting about something that just came up on, just happened, or I just wanted to make a video on it. Just a lot of smaller videos. And in this particular video, we're responding to PragerU, and it's about Dennis Prager and one of his fireside chats, talking about the morality without God, or at least adhering to your own conscience as your morality. But without further ado, it's Prager in time.
I understood what most professors don't understand. I knew this at 24, which is no compliment to me. In the past, most people knew it at the age of 24. Most people knew it, I think, at the age of 15. That it's the most important question in the world: is there a God?
Whether or not God exists is actually irrelevant to most things in the universe. To humans specifically, the most important question is how we ought design society. Humans have nothing without society, but lose nothing without God. All fundamental structures within society and humanity as a whole are independent of the God question and whether or not he exists. Money and markets exist independent of God. Medicine and infrastructure exist independent of God. Law and the will to act exist independent of God. Meaning also exists independent of God, but we'll get to that later. Society exists without God, but without society, we have none of that, including religion. Society is how we proliferate our species. It's how we advance in politics, science, technology, population, literature, art, etc. Humans are nothing but a speck of instinctual nothingness without society, so why should I care so much about whether or not an ultimate entity exists when he has no effect on my life? Society and its structure has the single greatest impact on humans and human well-being. This is why politics is so important. Unless, a big-ass meteor hit us, then that's pretty impactful. But other than that, society has the most impact. Even if you rejected society and took the hut-in-the-woods approach with only God as your guide, you would still be making that decision in reference to how you want to interact with society. So even when you reject it, it still has a big impact on your life. Religion and God are contrived and forced into society as needless excess. People find importance and meaning in them, and that's fine, that's all good. But they're not required for our well-being. It's simply another avenue of lifestyle and worldview preference. Not to mention, religion as a whole wouldn't exist without some society to propagate it and let it exist.
Because if there's no God, then there's really nothing. There's just this moment, this fragmentary moment of time in which we come into the universe, then we're gone for eternity. It's oblivion, which is a very sobering thought when you think about it. And not only that, there's no ultimate meaning to life. It's a coincidence that I'm here. It's a coincidence that you're here. It's pure coincidence that anything is here. There's no purpose to it all.
This is untrue. The biblical God is just an entity, a designer, and creator. The Bible asserts his meaning and his arbitration of meaning, but in reality, a God wouldn't have the capacity to prescribe a meaning to the universe. Meaning is incorporeal and intemporal. It exists in an immaterium. God designs and creates things. Meaning isn't a thing. It's a completely subjective perspective derived from a conscious entity's perception of their own individual life. Meaning cannot be universal, as the conscious experience is entirely subjective. The only objective thing in the universe for any individual is that their existence is true. I think, therefore I am, is the only objectively true statement in the totality of the universe. Beyond that, everything is purely subjective. And if the argument is that God asserts personalized meanings, this is simply untrue, as it's completely antithetical to the higher purpose narrative that is almost fundamental to the biblical religions, including Christianity. However, this is not to say that pessimistic nihilists are correct either. The universe doesn't not have a meaning. Life is not meaningless. As stated earlier, meaning isn't a thing, it's a perspective, and it's entirely subjective. Meaning exists conceptually, it simply doesn't have an objective, quintessential form. It is everyone's duty to form a meaning from within themselves, not from an external entity that may or may not even exist. And concerning an afterlife existing is perfectly independent from whether God exists or not. Plenty of religions have designed afterlife systems without a supreme being. It can be done. Even from an atheistic perspective, there can still be an afterlife. An afterlife doesn't even have to be associated with a religion or spirituality for it to be true.
Creation has no creator, it has no maker, it has no designer. What we think of as good and evil is purely opinion. There is no objective good and evil. It's just, I think murder is wrong, you think murder is right. Who's to decide, since there's nothing above us from which the moral code comes from?
Even with God, morality is pure opinion. The Bible claims that God is the arbiter of morality, but each and every single one of the hundreds of sects of the Abrahamic religions, which are all derived from the same 4 or 5 Bible variants, all have disagreeing opinions on morality and what is right and wrong. Even if the Bible was 100% correct, there's 3 or 4 different versions of the book to grab from, with no way to verify which one is the real one. And even further still, your interpretation of the Bible is also subjective, so it's possible you get 2 completely contradictory moral arguments from the same passage, all based on how each person interprets the message. Not to mention, even if God was the arbiter of morality, there is no way to understand it. If someone receives moral revelation from God, there is no way to verify whether it was a hallucination or God himself. It's completely unknowable. So even in the universe where God does exist and is the arbiter of morality, there would still be no objectivity to it that humans could grasp and understand. Due to this, all morality is a matter of opinion. The only people who decide which morality is correct is the body politic. Society itself decides how it should be governed, and even religions are governed and managed by societies. Therefore, the morality that the legal system uses will always follow the body politic's moral positions. Even if it strictly follows religious morality, that morality still comes from the societal interpretation of the teachings of that religion and not the religion itself. No morality is given to us objectively. Society must simply find which system and framework we ought to use, and God is not necessary for that. In fact, using God has been pretty counterproductive for the West.
So let me give you a different way of approaching the issue. Whenever I speak about the question of God and morality, for example, I will say to somebody, so to whom are you morally accountable? Right? I mean, I want you to think about that question for a moment. To whom or to what are you morally accountable for your behavior? And the answer I get is, I'm not accountable. I don't believe in a God to whom I'm accountable. I'm accountable to my conscience. That is the most common answer that I receive. So I want to talk to you today about conscience. How effective is the conscience? How morally productive is it? If you think about it for not too long, it turns out to be pretty weak. Here's a proof. People who do evil or support evil sleep well at night. And they are accountable to their conscience. And the people who do good are accountable to their conscience. So if the conscience could lead you to do bad and to do good, Of what use is the conscience? Think about it. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, if you will, introduced the idea that human sacrifice is evil. So therefore, people who obeyed that, their conscience would bother them if there was human sacrifice, but only because they were taught by something higher than their conscience that human sacrifice was wrong. So the good guys had a conscience and the bad guys had a conscience. This is true throughout history. So of what use, when you think about it, is the conscience unless you have a morally developed conscience? Yes, but then what gave you the moral development? What code? And ultimately in the West, it was a code that emanated from what we call Judeo-Christian values. Not only that, let's say you don't sleep well at night after you do evil. Obviously, your conscience wasn't particularly effective then either. So either your conscience is okay with your doing evil, or it's not okay, and it didn't stop you.
Everyone adheres to their conscience. Everyone, even religious people. The person who follows their emotions, the person who constructs their own moral framework, the person who follows the Word of God, even Jesus himself, they all answer to their own conscience. If you decide not to do something because God says that would be bad, that's you putting a limit on yourself. Just because you base that in something God says doesn't detract from the fact that you're still limiting yourself through the use of your own conscience. Me constructing my own moral framework, the guy who is normal and just goes along with life, and the Christian all follow an arbitrary set of rules that can only be enforced by their conscience. When a Christian decides not to do a bad thing because God said so, that isn't God reaching into him and keeping him from doing that thing. That would be a violation of the free will you people praise him for giving us. No, that's his conscience telling him not to do that because he holds a specific set of values. Those values simply happen to come from the Bible. As for the person who does evil and doesn't sleep well, that isn't their conscience. That person is retroactively feeling guilty. Their conscience guided them into the right direction, but their desire to do evil outweighed their conscience. The desire to do a thing and the moral values you hold are not always in equal power. This is why impulses exist. This is not a failure of conscience, this is a failure of impulse control. A Christian with fervent belief in God suffers the same amount of impulses as everyone else. If they do evil, then God wasn't particularly effective at swaying them. And if religious people really aren't guided by their conscience, but instead by the deity they worship, then that deity must be wildly ineffective, which is especially pathetic considering this deity in particular is supposed to be an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, supreme being. Just because they pray to God doesn't mean they answer to him. All people answer to their own conscience. Our conscience is simply guided by our values. It's all equally arbitrary. Though this is not to claim that I don't think that the conscience is ineffective. I do. It is ineffective. All I'm saying is that God and the adherence to God is just as ineffective as a conscience. Because all of it is your conscience.
Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that every religious person will act good. A lot of people who believe in God have acted bad. Of course, there are people who believe in God who've done evil. It's very hard to make good people. The best method we have is a combination of God and reason. God alone, you get fanaticism often. Reason alone, you get nothing. The places that drop God most are our universities and then the most morally absurd institutions in the Western world. That's where men give birth came from. That's where massive support for the idea of communism over capitalism, which is essentially evil over freedom, developed.
If universities are bad because they disregard God, then why is it that you people constantly simp for college graduates from STEM, which is a field that routinely disregards God? How are college graduates more likely to be successful and fulfilled in their careers than people without them? If universities are bad because they teach communism, I'd like to see where these communist universities are. There are Christian universities and there are normal universities. All have theology degrees and all have economic degrees that teach capitalist economics. You're not going to see a Marxism 101 career path that these universities offer. People turn out more left-leaning because the accumulation of knowledge generally makes more left-leaning people. Claiming universities are evil because communism is just you saying stuff. You're not claiming anything of value here. You're just mad that your supporters aren't coming from the more educated crowd, so instead of making content that actually appeals to academics, you're just seething and shutting them out instead. All your solutions are impotent and worthless, and you know that. Though, in fairness, this probably isn't because of a personal grudge against universities. It's a common trope among right-wingers to harbor disdain for higher education. The first place the Nazis went to burn were libraries, universities, and research organizations that researched degenerate science. It's not a new thing to be against academia amongst the right. It's been around since politics even became a thing societies engaged in at the public level.
All the people who gave Stalin, the greatest mass murderer in history outside of Mao, the atom bomb, came from the intellectual circles of the college educated. They think at colleges that you can develop great ideas without God. They're proof that you can't. Okay? There is no secular institution that produces wisdom. So God needs reason and reason needs God. And even then, we're not guaranteed. We need a third thing, by the way, a deep, unapologetic, unafraid commitment to truth. That's a biggie. Truth, reason, and God, and I'm speaking about specifically the God of the Bible, the Western Bible. Okay, I can't speak for other gods. I'm not knocking them. I'm just talking about that one. God, reason, truth. You have a chance for a good world. It isn't easy to produce one.
If reason alone gives us nothing, then how was germ theory, the most useful and life-saving discovery in all of medicine, discovered? That was made from pure reason. If reason alone gives us nothing, then how do most pure utilitarians live lives just as morally virtuous as any given Christian? If reason alone gives us nothing, then how did we get to the moon? If reason alone gives us nothing, then how did we make the automobile? If God alone is insufficient, then why should we follow God? If God and reason is also insufficient and an adherence to truth must be introduced, then why should we need God in the first place? Needing both God and truth separately implies that they are separate. God is not truth, God is something else. But what does God in particular bring to the table that reason and truth cannot provide? Nothing. The answer is nothing. If God is real, then good things are simply truly good, and bad things are simply truly bad. But we don't need to follow God to realize what those are. In fact, doing so wouldn't be sufficient. The only factor here that is required is an adherence to truth and reason. God adds nothing to this equation. Reason and truth are the only two things that bring anything of value. God arbitrates morality, and adherence to truth will find it regardless of God's worship. God created science, and adherence to reason will be discovered regardless of God's worship. God brings us nothing. And that is going to wrap up this video. The rest of the video in the fireside chat is just Q&A, so I don't really want to cover that. Plus, it's like 15 minutes of Q&A. I don't want to cover that. It really seems like overall Dennis doesn't really want to make the point about godless morality. He just wants to kind of tiptoe around it by attacking the conscience. But really his problem seems to be godless morality, but he doesn't just want to bluntly make that point for whatever reason. But yeah, that'll wrap up this video. Please donate to my Patreon like this guy did. He was just awesome. My first patron ever. I'm so happy. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I will be back in like a week or two or something. I don't know. Fucking at some point.